Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander.
Ken, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Stoked to be here.
Yeah, likewise. So not too far from each other. I'm in Midtown. You're in Brooklyn, which has been less common lately to get New Yorkers on the show. So show some strength. Although you're going to be
together.
Yeah, exactly. Although I know you're going to be sounds like you're going out west soon, which will be exciting. But anyway, I'd love to start. Can you talk a little bit about your background and kind of how you came to work with RevenueZen?
Yeah, absolutely. So Chief Growth Officer here at RevenueZen now and a managing partner. But I mean, it's really been, I'll give the the shorter and more interesting version. But essentially, I started off my life thinking I would do sales. I talked with a guidance counselor after winning a sales competition. They're like, you should try this digital marketing thing. I was like, what the heck is SEO? You're telling me there's not wizards and unicorns back there making it all happen. Worked for a few agencies, did the freelancing thing, started to grow my own inbound marketing agency. And at a certain point, it was at that flexion of like, do I want to keep growing this? What do I want to do? With agency, it's not a business for everybody. And so last February, RevenueZen and I merged essentially. And yeah, it's been match made in heaven ever since. I'm a huge nerd. I've been tinkering around with every business model you can think of since I was like 12 years old. So including lawnmowers. So
yeah, that makes sense. So I think that a lot of the times, like chief growth officer, excuse me, I fumbled that, is one of these titles that's relatively new, and like a lot of times people don't know what it means. So what's your day-to-day like as chief growth officer? I fumbled it again. How would you describe that role?
Yeah, and I very transparently, I had no idea what that was. I was intentional with choosing that role, and for us, it's less about titles as it is day-to-day function. And so I'll sort of give context for folks who have never heard of it, particularly if you're not from the world of startups, where I see that most often, or like a Fortune 500 company. But it's essentially, my function is a mix between a head of product, a chief marketing officer, and then the chief revenue officer. So for example, like I'm building out our sales process, hiring our first salesperson that isn't me and the CEO of the company. I'm also building tools for our employees internally to use. And we also, have SaaS products, our SaaS product that we're working on, right? And everything in between. So my day-to-day looks like somebody sends something in the automation channel. Hey, this script that we wrote for the keyword prioritization tool is a little buggy, or we want these features. What do you think? Another example might be where, I'm scoping out a new deal with our new growth manager, and he's got a question about this part of the process has some friction in the sales process. What's the SOP around that? And then a third example would be I'm checking out our own rankings. B2B SaaS SEO agency dropped to number 2 instead of number 1. I'm looking at our competitor, figuring out what happened, maybe for the monthly meeting with the marketing manager of the site. So everything in between as well.
Yeah, that insight I think is really interesting. And kind of part of that is a lot of our listeners, I think, are have lots of big questions about who to hire when, like we all do, especially when it comes to sales and new business and growth and that sort of thing. So would you mind talking a little bit about the genesis of RevenueZen and like who did they hire when, and also like the acqui-hire model is really interesting. Like why did they decide to do that then? And what was compelling about that decision to bring you on in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So few threads there. The first is that RevenueZen started out, and shout out to Alex, our CEO, super smart dude. He worked for a company called Dinero, where he was the head of growth. So to him, business development, scaling a sales team, methodology around sales and how to close, that was his wheelhouse. So they actually started out by doing lead gen, similar to what you mentioned your business model is. So helping, startups not only build out their own sales team, but running teams of SDRs that were, either outsourced or worked in-house. And then on LinkedIn, sort of doing a quasi like social selling model, but also helping people scale their outreach on LinkedIn. And over time, what he saw for their clients is that they needed other things, like content assets for sales enablement. Instead of just saying, here, sales rep, go talk, it's, well, here's this deck or some top of funnel content to educate them before they ever get to you. So they're half closed. They're a lot warmer. And as that evolved, it became, okay, well, now we need coaching with our on-site marketing that makes sure it's consistent with our LinkedIn profile optimization and so on and so forth. And so that was kind of the natural progression to them saying, well, what's this SEO thing? What's inbound marketing all about? Because paid is great. Outbound has its place. I think there's no such thing as the perfect channel or perfect tactic or strategy, but clients were asking about it. And that's when me and Alex sort of met at a sales talk that he was giving at my co-working space. And I was like, hey, man, you said some interesting things, but here's what you should know about inbound. And we started working together and collaborating. But after 10 clients collaborating, we're like, this needs to be more integrated. Like, we need to be actual partners. And so that naturally led to my company, which purely was demand generation from inbound marketing. So SEO and content to the website, credit card swipes, like that's what my company did. So it was very natural to blend those two frames together, and that you get sort of what we have now, which is demand generation using SEO, content marketing, and LinkedIn. So that's how we found each other and came together. And really, their business model, we've sort of seen the writing on the wall as far as organic has such a huge part in the B2B buyer's journey. There's more touches, but they have nothing to do with salespeople for a lot of companies that we work with. And we wanted to be that, that architect and that sort of partner with them. So
yeah, I definitely want to get into that and kind of what's working on that front. First, though, I think you mentioned that you're hiring a salesperson now. So like what informed that decision? What level did you want to get the company at to get to the point where you're like, okay, I'm going to get sales off my plate now?
Yeah, I forgot to answer that about the hiring cadence, but essentially it was, the subject matter experts, the folks who are the specialists doing the work for a long time. And then we're a bit top heavy. We have 4 executives and then now a director of strategy. But back then it was essentially like, here are the SDRs and then the LinkedIn writers and then Alex and the co-founder. As we've grown, though, we've added different essentially specialists. So there's a person who focuses only on analytics, only on SEO. For content marketing, there's somebody who's only focused on editorial, like how things sound, not even strategically, like from where we're driving traffic. And so that was the model. At our size, we're 15 people, that it's basically leadership, the 5 of us, and then the subject matter experts, the specialists. But one of the challenges was Alex was so particularly good and charming, which, like myself, not that I'm charming, but I was good at selling the thing that I created. It's hard to scale that because you're leveraging your own expertise. It's not like a t-shirt where the benefit is sort of pretty clear and it's a low amount of purchase. So some people do demos if they have high tickets. Some people like the more customized approach, but we just couldn't get that right. So one thing that I did was not only create SOPs around the sales process end to end, I created a strategy road mapping tool that, based on a few inputs and then a lot of automation, actually spits out recommended scope of work for the human using it. So it was to expedite our research process and scoping process, but now the human that we hired, who does the business development, he can actually use that without never doing SEO in his life and be super accurate. So it's in part like SOP plus that tool. But for us, we knew it was time when he could reliably build a scope exactly like we would build.
Yeah, that's great. And I know with our business, like we hired a salesperson recently. It went really well. That the person was ramped up well. She unfortunately left to pursue an entrepreneurial venture. So we're back on the horse of rehiring again, which happens. But I felt like it went well because we had gotten like our lead gen up to a certain level. We've been doing this a long time, eating our own dog food. We had a lot of, like you described, the SOPs and that sort of thing in order. And I also put a lot of energy into coaching this person. We got an outside coach as well to help. Like, it's almost honestly like another part-time job getting this person ramped up. So I'd love to hear, like, what have you learned from that process? Like, at what level did you get to in terms of like leads and support in order to feel comfortable like sending this person off versus, and honestly, like the nerve-wracking part of being like, I've got to let this person maybe fail and like blow up deals that I could have won, right? Like, how have you dealt with that?
Yep. So I will say, as far as if folks out there wondering what's the inflection point of how I know, for us, we wanted our inbound lead flow to be consistent enough because, again, we eat our own dog food too. SEO, LinkedIn, referrals, and content are the ways that we drive leads and the only ways that we drive leads. So getting between 20 and 30, at least marketing qualified opportunities consistently inbound, we know that human doesn't have to go out and hunt and be thrown in the trenches. So that was thing number one. We have that consistent lead flow. Our business is going up and to the right. Our net margin is healthy. So there's no consequences if they don't work out. We also decided to take an existing person from within the company who is interested in this role. So that's sort of a reduction of risk. And what I would advise folks is not only, you might think differently, but I like giving somebody warm leads versus just telling them to go hunt, because that was my first job, was a sales job where I cold called and went to knock on dentist doors. And it was demoralizing because there was no structure, but I couldn't, it's like I do jujitsu, and my first couple of weeks with the blue belts and the brown belts, I couldn't even plan an attack because I was just drowning. And so we think that's bad to develop a human. So that's the sort of how you know of it. But as far as working with him specifically, he's an absolute gem as a human. The tougher things that I think people should consider is, do you have time to coach that person? That's 5 to 10 hours a week of my time, is just literally going over, debriefing after he takes a sales call, looking at a scope, answering questions, saying, here's how I would have done this differently, or asking a really good question. So time for coaching, it's a big, something I didn't anticipate as much of, but also just continuing to build out a process that if this human wasn't here, could somebody else come in and get ramped up more quickly than they did, and not just letting them go be a rock star, which hopefully they will be, but you don't want a rock star whose, again, uniqueness is the reason they're selling deals. It should be the systems approach of this, we put this input in, we put a human who's smart and capable, and out comes, these things that we want to happen.
So. Yeah. And I'll just mention, you stepped into a bucket of worms, because I train too. And I make jujitsu metaphors every 5 minutes.
Oh,
awesome. So our audience is like, crap, I hope these two guys don't start nerding out on jujitsu, because that's going to suck. So I won't subject everyone to that. We can talk offline about training and everything. But that's really interesting. And I think, yeah, that's what we've seen as well. And that's the biggest problem that we see within our world, like agencies or B2B businesses, is hiring a salesperson and then just sending them off into the cold and expecting that to work, when really sales is a bunch of different skill sets that and a bunch of different building blocks that have to be in place. To shift gears a little bit and go to, your expertise, or your original expertise with inbound. I think that a lot of the times there's so much hand-wringing about what to do for inbound marketing in general, but especially for B2B, because it seems like it's way more opaque because the sample size is smaller, right?
Yep.
And there's so much, and I know I want this too, in my business, when we do inbound, is what's going to convert? Is it the webinar? The webinar's out of style now. Is it the live thing? Is it the handout? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. What's the through line on the thing that converts, I guess? What are you seeing to work, is the simplified version of that question.
Yep. So the first thing that I like to get across to folks who think that there's a specific channel or set of tactics or set of strategies, is that even myself focusing on inbound, I'm pretty agnostic as far as what's the possible best fit for you. And I regularly tell people that we're not the right fit for them. Some startups, I'm like, you need to be spending money on paid social because you have that kind of platform, or you should you should pay 6 SDRs to literally go pound the pavement, because people will want this as soon as they hear it. But essentially, I think about it as, if you have a human being who you want to purchase from you defined, and you have a list of the worst parts about their day-to-day job, and you match that to the features of your platform or the services that you offer, and you write stuff about the solution to those pain points that match to those features, and you write stuff at every step of their decision-making process, and you know nothing about SEO or content strategy, you will perform well, because that's what a buyer's journey is. And so the tactics within that, I'm happy to dive into any, but essentially architecting, when this person doesn't even know, they want to generate more leads, what do they need to know to start? What does a VP of marketing need to know to start? Second, if they are solution aware, for SEO, what do they need to know about the intricacies before they have confidence that we might be a partner, right? That might be a guide That might be a playbook or something like that. Then when they need to vet you, what are they going to do? They want to learn more. So you'll go on our site, you'll see there's specific pages and even little demo videos about each and every one of our services. Then what's going to be on their mind? Can I trust these people? Case studies, customer stories, testimonial. It's like that typical journey somebody's going to take. You can architect that and put the assets up. And without optimizing it, you're going to convert those humans, even if you're just doing outbound, because they will check your profiles, they will check your site, so they'll already be pre-qualified, or they'll self-select and they won't even reach out because now they know exactly what you do. So I think it's a win-win, and that's the through line, regardless if you know the tactics, is that kind of architecture. So does that make sense?
It does. And I think that does make sense. I think most people would agree with that. I want to pose kind of like a hypothetical that I think will sound familiar to a lot of our audience, right? So
Sure.
let's say that I'm an agency owner. We've got boutique agency. I've been around for a decade or more. 90% of the business is from referrals and personal networks. We have, a handful, maybe 5 different verticals we work with. We have the same number of services, maybe 4 or 5 different possible services we can do. And then within each vertical, we have 2 or 3 or 4 different decision makers, right? So there's like this mishmash of variables. How do you get focused? Like, if you're going to build out that buyer journey and reinvent your site and your materials like you guys are so good at, like, what's my starting point to just get clarity on what I want to do there with buyer journeys?
Yeah. And this is actually a common sort of pain of why people haven't started, which the best time to do inbound is yesterday, right? Or 10 years ago.
Mhm.
But essentially, I think people over index on how they'll be judged, which sounds very woo woo, but it's actually like, I'm talking about speed and deploying an MVP and then analyzing the data and then letting that help you make decisions versus analysis paralysis for 3, 6, 8 months, building one landing page, but you could have tested 20. And it's not that difficult to build out 4 landing pages for each core persona, throw them on your site. And if you see in 4 weeks that they gravitate, the VPs are reading that more and the CIO isn't, you just take the page down. Or if you see that in Search Console, even though there's no users, you can see the impressions as a KPI, right? For all of those of you who don't know, go install Google Search Console. It shows you what keywords people type in to come to your site. And that kind of stuff is like, if you deploy those 4 pages, or if you deploy that, that 5 blog posts or that guide, you can see pretty quickly things like impression counts, clicks, traffic, even as KPIs. And then you don't have to guess or wait. The data, your users, your conversion counts have spoken for you. So I would say for folks wondering what to zoom in on, you don't have to. That's the beauty of digital marketing. You can A/B test. You could just do an informal test, like I just mentioned, of putting them up and looking at the data. And we think that's way more effective, especially like B2B, where there's smaller sample sizes, where if we let the data speak for our optimizations or inform our optimizations. So does that make sense?
I think that's a really good point. And another thing, a thing that I've learned, and I'm sort of like, more of an outbound guide, but I've
Sure.
been experimenting with different channels. Obviously, we have a podcast, and we have somebody that's running it's handling a paid media spend on Google search and some other things we've toyed with Facebook ads and now LinkedIn ads and that sort of thing. Is the mistake that I've made is sort of like underappreciating the amount of time and energy that goes into the creativity of like coming up with the things to test, testing it. And I think the management of the spend and the sort of tinkering on the interface is like relatively inexpensive to outsource. The creative endeavor, though, is much bigger thing. And obviously you guys handle that for your clients and for yourselves and so on. So to hopefully bring this to a question, I guess, like, what's that starting point? Like, if I'm starting at 0, how do I create that sandbox for testing, and like what channels should I be thinking about? And like, honestly, like, who's handling that and how much time should they be reserving to handle that process?
Yeah, you're right that the creative, we call it the brand's like verbal identity. We don't do visual identity stuff like graphic design or logos, but that's the biggest friction of working with us, because we're never going to sound like that human. And often the person, the founder, the marketing, the lead, they're going to be the most protective over that in their own mind. So I would say, if you're defining who we should be, like what type of company, how we want to sound, it's not a good idea to start like any sort of big inbound campaign and then figure that out. You should probably understand who your target customer is and kind of how you want to sound and what you want to offer them. Like that, we're not in the business of crafting an offer for you, or like you don't know who you want to sell to. I think that's much likely to generate, like, it'll push out the time to value with us just transparently. What I would say though, if somebody's looking to do this internally, is definitely start there. Understand like a human, like an actual human. Target personas seem to have fallen like by the wayside, but like your target customer should be down to a science.
Yeah.
How you want to position yourself in the market, it's very simple. There's 100,000 books on product market fit or positioning. But so let's assume those things are done. The next step is like, I kind of said it, but I'll sort of re-go back to it, is identify like who that target person is, or target 3 people in the organization. I'll even give it a number. Write down a list of 10 things that they're most frustrated by on their day-to-day. Map that to a feature of your platform or a specific subservice. Write out a statement of how that solves that pain point, and then go make a page for that about that service or feature or solution, a piece of content or 2 that might answer a question that they have about, at the top of the funnel. Essentially, they don't know they want a solution, but they need to learn. And then some kind of resource that proves that what you're talking about to answer that, right? That's a guide, white paper, checklist, demo video, whatever you want to call it. And then go put some social proof on your site that looks and sounds like those humans, 1 to 2 per person. That's the basic schema, is what I would tell everybody. You don't need to do any research, no tools, but that'll be a good starting point.
Yeah, I think that's really, really helpful. And one thing that helped me a lot was sort of like treating the testing as like a separate sandbox, like having,
Yep.
for us, it's Unbalanced, but there's a million tools you could use. And then having that be the place where things get tested. And then the main site is just don't worry about it until you have something that's like really definitive, that I think just psychologically and just in terms of like speed helped us a lot. But I'd love to hear how you think about that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent point. A lot of our customers will come to us and say, we want to start A/B testing this button color. I'm like, all right, let's dive into your Oh, looks like you're getting 0 MQLs inbound. So let's actually focus on driving some traffic and getting some rankings before we're randomly testing button colors. And I think that's that shiny object syndrome. Again, I'm always going to push back to those fundamentals, like get that up and then we can start testing. But as far as testing methodologies and platforms, I think anything before like a few thousand users is a moot point as far as that kind of intricate testing. I would say though that I like to test things on the actual domain, and a lot of our clients use like a Webflow or a WordPress, and so they have those testing capabilities. Unbounce I've used, but mostly for like paid campaigns in the past. I think that depends on your scenario. If we're optimizing for SEO, that user engagement on those pages on our primary domain gives us a little uptick and benefit. So, and we can sort of refine based on that. But again, I prioritize speed over anything. If somebody can't figure out A/B testing on WordPress, use Unbounce if you need leads tomorrow.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I think like it's one thing that I've sort of pushed back on with the inbound community, and this isn't like a major disagreement, like I think X works and Y doesn't work. They obviously both have their places, is the sort of mindset that like a decision maker in a company needs to go through a bunch of content in order to agree to have a sales call. And our experience has been that if you reach out the right way, the barrier to building that relationship is actually lower than people think. The problem is most people are trying to like over automate it and send people a message that they'll never want to respond to and force somebody into a sales process. And that's really like the biggest problem. So I think obviously like the truth somewhere in the middle, like the content, it can be really useful. But to hopefully bring this to a question, I just love to understand like, what is that? Let me make it more specific, like to our audience, like let's say you're looking to get a meeting with the VP of marketing at like a growth stage direct to consumer brand or something. Like if that person's reading articles, like what do you think by and large the minimum level of research that person needs to do in order to be like, yes, I'll take a call with this sort of company right now?
Yeah. So this gets into like the philosophy sort of side of these different channels. And the reason why I like content marketing and SEO is because by the way, we do see those paths like in our own conversion journeys. We'll see somebody that comes in maybe from LinkedIn, from one of our profiles, doesn't read or look at anything. They just read the marketing thesis, the about page, spend 2 seconds on the service page, and then reach out. And they came from probably a referral or seeing a LinkedIn, but I don't know that specifically. But my point is, we've also seen somebody go read 8 blog posts, all 5 of our service pages, use the ROI tool, read the marketing thesis, check out my profile page on our own website. So what I'm saying is, I like to give people those options to self-qualify and warm themselves up, sort of without needing to be on a call, because our calls, I'm telling you, they're like butter. They're like butter when people get to us. I mean, It's a beautiful thing for how we like to sell in our methodology. So I would say that you're absolutely right. And I don't think there's a typical, how many touches they need, despite Gartner telling us differently. I get it. The average is 18, right. But we've seen 1 and up to 30, right? So for me, I agree with you that this idea that they need to go through this architected customer journey every time is outdated and wrong. However, we can see this from our user data, that people do read those assets, and those calls are really simple after they do. It's literally one guy's question before he closed on one call was, I know everything about you. I know your pricing from the pricing page. Can you just tell me how you got into inbound? And I did. And then he closed. I mean, that's not typical, but you understand my point is the information's there for them to take whatever journey they want, versus a single landing page. There's not too many. I mean, I get it. Funnels are great. We like that pick your own adventure demand gen. That's just our philosophy.
Yeah, that's really good. And I want to talk about pricing on your site because that's super interesting. But the first sure. thing I have is let's talk about nurturing a little bit. So somebody agrees to talk to you. They came through SEO or whatever channel. What are you finding to work for once the appointment's booked? What's that experience? A lot of people send a drip video or this sequence, or how do you get them kind of ramped up into that buttery situation when they're on the phone, to use your words?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of sort of baked into when people reach out. They've usually done their research. If they came in from LinkedIn, they already kind of trust us because they've been following our profile. So I'll say that maybe 20% of the work of sending this is about us, or here's our deck to warm them up, usually is done, as far as maybe how other channels from when we did paid ads used to run. And then we only sort of do the same approach. We don't really drip after they're closed loss or they don't follow up. So I'll speak within our process because we don't do nurturing afterwards. The first touch, we already have done some pre-research, particularly using that tool that I mentioned. It's mostly just what's the right way to put it? We're sort of setting the vision with a basically discovery and some information gathering, because we are a service. So we're not going to have the same deliverable set for everybody, even though our methodology follows the same process. Then it's also, we give specific recommendations on that call. And that's for a very specific reason. People often refer us, even if they don't have the money to be a customer. They just were so impressed with that initial sort of consultative sales approach. That's what they'll do. So that goes well, get the follow-up scheduled. But in that time period, we build them out a strategy that informs the scope. And what I mean by strategy is, using that tool I built, it'll say, for instance, you have no middle of the funnel content assets on your site. We recommend X, Y, and Z for these reasons. And the tool is really smart. It does that. And then we use 20, 30% of our brains to make it hyper specific. These are the exact landing pages you need. This is the query research. This is your potential total addressable search market. So they get that right before the second call. It's got a little demo video for, whatever CEO might want to take a peek. We have a projection if the CFO needs to know some numbers. So all of that has been packaged to basically preempt all of the objections I've heard for the last 7 years, are almost always answered by that second and usually final call. At that point, they're like, heck yes, this is going to work. It's onto red lines with the legal team. Or maybe they need to bring in somebody like the CMO, because we're working with VPs and heads of demand gen a lot. And at that point, it's basically just to handshake and look you in the eye from the person above. And we know they're either the wrong fit or the right fit. And that usually happens within a couple months, right? From first touch to close. Our average sales cycle is about 2.5 months. So
yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I think that's really helpful to agencies and others that are kind of like all over the place with their sales process and just think like this is the way it has to be, we're special, it's like
Yeah.
why would it have to be like that? So that's really great. And it's really cool that you guys are practicing what you preach, because that's not always a given either. Let's talk about pricing on the site, which is very unconventional. I think that I've seen that for SaaS products, or like sub $1,000 a month products. What inspired you to do that, and how has it gone?
Yeah. I mean, we run on an MRR model. We have subscription. I mean, we have SaaS now too, but we've always ran the agency exactly like you would expect a SaaS company to be. And I think when you're productizing a service, look at the folks who have automated the service to productize it and then automate it yourself. So that's exactly what our model has always been. The pricing is because that's just how I buy things. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, the agencies I've talked to that don't have pricing, it's either been they're scared or they're too custom. And I don't speak for everybody. I just mean I've talked to a lot of agencies and I'm like, why is it taking me 2 weeks to get a price? Even if it isn't the right price for me, I'm going to vet vendors, and I have a list in my spreadsheet of minimums and maximums that we need to spend, and you're not even going to make the cut. And I don't want to jump on 2 sales calls to know that. And so we didn't have pricing for a long time until, again, a lot of our clients, 65% of our book plus B2B SaaS. It's their expected buying behavior. And my job is to give them what they need to make an informed decision, whether it's us or another agency. And so what we find is that folks who've looked at the pricing page have already self-selected to pretty much be in our ICP. And if they look at that page and don't reach out, well, maybe they got price shock. Maybe they want, a person to just churn out a bunch of articles that are, just serve like top of funnel. And that's great. That just saved me 30 minutes of my day. So not only do people actually look at it, it's sort of a pre-qualifying mechanism for our personal ICP. And then it's just something I wanted as a buyer, and that I heard other people mention they expect. They're like, I didn't see pricing, or maybe do you guys do packages? And so now, even though we do have a little bit of custom that's involved, everyone doesn't need every deliverable. They know they have these buckets to say, okay, well, we have $8,000. We need link building. We need content. I now have a framework to have this conversation with RevenueZen versus I guess I'm at the whim of these salespeople who want to take me in every which way.
I think that's a valid argument. Just to push back a little, or play devil's advocate, to
Sure.
a lot of people, what a lot of people might be thinking. Do you think there's like a fine line? Like, for example, obviously having to get on 2 calls to get pricing is like a lot of wasted time for everyone involved. But do you think that there's a situation where somebody's like just doesn't know, right? Where they would have seen that price and not converted because they're like, this is way more than I thought. But then if you were able to get on a call with them and like give them more context live, then maybe you could have gotten a certain percentage of business back. And that person would have also been better off because they've been educated, you've built the relationship, et cetera, et cetera. Like, how do you feel about that tension?
Yeah, I actually think that's a very valid concern. But there's a reason why we didn't go with that. It's because we're not consultants. People go through the RevenueZen machine. It's like the only difference is we pull things out, but we don't like randomly add stuff in based on their needs. We can literally analyze historical data to say, and we have these deliverables in this order at these quantities equal this output for our clients. We have a dashboard of everybody's performance historically of all of our clients and the deliverables that mapped to that. So if you don't have that kind of structure in your consultants, then that actually makes very little sense to just have strict, buckets of pricing, because you have no clue, because you do a different thing for everybody's needs. But the second thing is we also say right at the top of the page in bold, this is to help you make a good decision to know if you want to reach out to us, but the final deliverable scope will be up based on our conversation. So let's chat. It's free, and we're going to give you stuff you can implement on the call in real time. So that's how I sort of handled what I think you're getting at, which is that most of our clients don't fit neatly in those buckets, but they need to know that these buckets are what are going to get them to success, like at least the framework. And let's chat, because why not? So we do make that known at the top of the site. So,
No,
but very
I think
valid
that's
concern. Yeah,
sure. Sorry, Coach. I was just going to say, I think that's a helpful distinction. And it sounds like you also, go back to the jiu-jitsu metaphor, like you guys are brown belts or black belts of this and that. a lot of people they've already gotten a lot of context by the time they're getting to the pricing page, versus your everyday company doing this is not necessarily going to have that context brought, and they might lose more than they gain from it. So I think that's a good distinction to make. Another thing that I love about your site is you have a marketing thesis on there, and it's a lot of people
Yeah.
have lots of different things about their philosophies on their sites, but I like the framing of marketing thesis. And I think what's cool about that is it reminds me of like a hedge fund or something, where it's like we actually do have
Yeah.
a thesis for how we invest. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, what informs that, and how would you describe that thesis?
Yeah, it came about because if you go on, Alex Boyd, the CEO of RevenueZen, and then my profile, Ken Magma Marshall, you can just type that into your browser. There's nobody else named that. We would just spout off these things that we actually do. A third of our leads come from LinkedIn. Another, third to a fourth every month come inbound from SEO. So that's how we built our businesses. So we do have a ton of thoughts around it, because we're not just charging people for stuff. It's stuff that we believe in, because that's how we had no other choice. We didn't take advantage of other channels, maybe stupidly, but now it's seemingly paid off. We were pretty like nose down on our channels when we started the companies. And so these philosophies of like, where no channel or tactic is correct, I'll pre-qualify my prospects on a sales call faster than they can. People have their credit cards out, and I'm like, absolutely not. You should go do X, Y, and Z. Come talk to me in 7 months when you raise your second round, or something like that. So part of it is just, that's what we think is best, and that's how we've built our companies. But part of it is we wanted folks to know who's not a good fit for us. And again, we try to. This is another thing for all you agencies out there. You don't need to get. I mean, I get if you're struggling for business. But at scale, and when you're having to hire a salesperson and make your team happy, you want to disqualify it as quickly and as often as possible. That's actually, we don't leave opportunities in Salesforce past a certain point. It just automatically gets disqualified because we don't find that's a good opportunity for us anyway. They don't have a large customer lifetime value if they take a certain amount of time for us. And so the marketing thesis was just stuff that we do every day, but also that we want people to know how you're a good fit for RevenueZen. Like if you have, I just had to do this service level agreement where it had these specific timelines. And it's like, if you have expectations around timelines, or you want us to do an email newsletter, we're probably not a good fit. Or if you just want somebody to write content for the sake of writing content and put some keywords in there, go hire that firm in, whatever other place that's cheaper than us. That's what I would want you to do, in my honest advice as a friend. So it all comes from what we do and who we are, which is rare, like you said, to act. People usually do values because they think it'll sound good. We ranted so often that we're like, why don't we write this down? It's been 7 years.
Yeah, and it's definitely less mealy mouthed than the values thing, right? So, and that makes sense. And ultimately, yeah, at a certain level, like you're just weighing yourself down with clients that don't have the potential to be with you for a while, right? So that makes a lot of sense. Kind of getting towards the end of our time, I'd love to just learn, like, what are you working on these days? I know you mentioned you have a new software tool, as do we, which is cool. So I'd love to hear
Nice.
how that's going.
Yeah, that's the fun part of my job, is just sort of dreaming and living 5 years in the future. And we're building internal tools for our employees to make their lives easier. So deciding what keywords that you have the right to own, how you should even target these. Just everyone has access to the same data, but how do you know that you have the right to own? There's a tool for that now, right? That our strategists can just click run, and they can at least get 80% there of knowing what to do. We've got our SaaS product that's launched. It's basically an operating system for social selling. Instead of knowing, well, this person in my ideal client profile posted, I got to go follow up with them in the comment. It has a lot of that intelligence baked in for you to make that social selling process easier. So RevenueZen in 3 years is a growth platform, not unlike HubSpot, where you can learn, get diagnosed with a tool, decide if you need agency help, decide if you want to take one of our like social selling course that you can just buy on demand, and everything in between with an agency arm. Right. So we're just wanting to be that go-to growth hub or platform for everybody in the next 3 years. So, and that makes me super happy and excited.
Yeah. That sounds like a plan. Oh, forgot to ask, tell us about your nickname, Magma.
Oh yeah. Okay. Great story. So the founder, Alex, and I were out to brunch because in Portland, Oregon, that's what you do, with my wife. And we're just having fun and talking. And I asked him, what object would you be, or something abstract other than a human? And I think he said like a supernova, because he's a very poetic man. And I was like, okay, now do me. And he just sort of paused and thought about it. And he's like, Ken, you are very much like an active volcano. He's like, you are, this beautiful, great to look at, always on the go force. And he's like, but if you get too close, you'll probably get hurt, because I'm a very forward person. I can have a forceful personality. And he's like, and Kim, and he looks at my wife and he's like, you're like this cool, calm bucket of water that stops him from hurting the rest of us and just keeps it to this beautiful force of nature. And I thought that was awesome. And so it's stuck ever since.
Yeah, that's cool. I wish I needed somebody to give me a cool nickname like that. It sounds like fun.
Go to brunch.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like a very Brooklyn day. So it sounds like fun, man. How can people get in touch with you guys and follow what you're up to and so on?
Sure. So yeah, Ken Magma Marshall, type it into your phone or browser. Go hang out on LinkedIn. I'm always putting my enchilada recipes on there. Made some hot sauce recently. And with a little bit of marketing advice, or just, strategy calls are always free. I always tell people reaching out to me equals updating something on your site same day that's going to improve whether you become a customer or not. And then lastly, go check out the website. Social selling course just launched for all of you who may not need hand holding or something to build out your social selling program, but want to know how to get started. 7-figure social selling. It's up and live. So
awesome. That sounds great, Ken. We'll get that linked up. Ken, thanks for coming on the show, man. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks. Take care, Dan.